When Staff Sergeant Joseph Joe Kowalski stood before the field kitchen on that gray November morning in 1944, watching the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One, line up for breakfast that he knew he couldn't provide because German artillery had destroyed their last supply convoy 12 hours earlier and headquarters estimated it would be 3 days minimum before new supplies could reach their position deep in the Hurtgen forest, he experienced a moment of crystalline clarity that made him grip his ladle so hard his knuckles turned white. If he didn't figure out a way to feed 3,000 combat soldiers who were already exhausted, undermanned, and facing the most brutal close-quarters fighting of the European campaign, those men would begin collapsing from hunger within 48 hours and the entire offensive that had cost so many lives to establish would collapse with them. In that moment, staring at the empty supply crates and the expectant faces of soldiers who trusted him to keep them fed the way they trusted their officers to keep them alive, Joe conceived of a plan so audacious, so technically impossible, and so completely insane that when he finally explained it to his commanding officer 2 hours later, Colonel Morrison would call it the most ridiculous thing I've heard since a private tried to convince me we could win the war by dropping propaganda. Leaflets written in Pig Latin, but within 72 hours, Joe's insane plan would not only save the Big Red One from starvation but would revolutionize how the U.S. Army thought about field logistics and would earn Joe a Bronze Star, a promotion, and a reputation as the man who could create meals out of thin air and determination. Joseph Kowalski was 31 years old in November 1944, a first-generation American whose parents had immigrated from Poland in 1910 and who had grown up in the tight-knit Polish community of Chicago's South Side. His father had worked in the stockyards, and Joe had been expected to follow that path, but he'd discovered a passion for cooking while helping his mother prepare meals for the large extended family that gathered every Sunday. After high school, Joe had worked in restaurant kitchens, eventually becoming a line cook at one of Chicago's better establishments, learning not just how to cook but how to manage food logistics, how to make meals from whatever ingredients were available, and how to feed large numbers of people efficiently. When the war came, Joe had enlisted immediately, and his cooking experience had landed him in the Quartermaster Corps as a field cook. It wasn't the glamorous combat role that some of his friends had sought, but Joe had quickly learned that feeding an army was its own kind of warfare, a constant battle against logistics, weather, supply chain breakdowns, and the simple challenge of producing thousands of hot meals daily under field conditions that would defeat most civilian restaurants. Joe had been with the 1st Infantry Division since North Africa, had cooked for them through Sicily and Normandy, and had developed a reputation as a cook who could make something edible out of almost nothing. When supplies ran short, Joe improvised. When equipment failed, Joe found workarounds. When men were sick of the standard field rations, Joe somehow made them taste different, better, more like home. But the situation they faced in the Hurtgen forest in November 1944 was beyond anything Joe had encountered before. The Hurtgen was a nightmare, a dense evergreen forest along the German-Belgian border where the 1st Infantry Division and other American units were engaged in some of the most brutal fighting of the war. The forest was so thick that air support was largely useless. The Germans were dug in deeply, fighting for every meter. Casualties were horrific. And now, with winter approaching, supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. The morning of November 15, 1944, began like most mornings in the Hurtgen, cold, wet, and gray. Joe had been up since 0400, preparing breakfast for the battalion, when the runner arrived with news that made his stomach drop. The supply convoy that was supposed to arrive overnight had been hit by German artillery. Most of the trucks were destroyed. Some supplies had been salvaged and diverted to other units with more critical needs. The 3rd Battalion would receive no resupply for at least 3 days, possibly longer. Joe did a quick inventory of what he had left. Enough food for maybe 8 more meals if he stretched it impossibly thin. 3,000 men eating 3 meals a day meant 9,000 meals needed over 3 days. He had food for 8 meals total. The mathematics were devastating. His assistant cooks, Corporal Martinez and Private Wilson, looked at him with the kind of fear that comes from understanding exactly how bad a situation is. "What do we do, Sarge?" Martinez asked quietly, his usual cheerful demeanor completely gone. Joe didn't answer immediately. He was thinking, his mind running through every option, every possibility. They could try to stretch the existing supplies even further, but there was a limit to how far you could stretch food before you were essentially serving hot water and calling it soup. They could try foraging in the forest, but this was combat territory. Foraging parties would be vulnerable to German fire, and the Hürtgen forest in November wasn't exactly rich in edible plants anyway. "We tell them breakfast is delayed," Joe said finally. "Tell them we're having logistical issues with the field kitchen equipment. Buy us a couple hours to figure this out." As Martinez went to spread the delay announcement, Joe walked away from the kitchen area, needing space to think. He found himself at the edge of the battalion's perimeter, looking out at the dense forest that had become their prison and battlefield. Somewhere out there were German positions. Somewhere behind them were American supply lines that had failed them. And right here were 3,000 men who needed to eat. That's when Joe saw it, or rather remembered it. 3 days ago, during a brief lull in the fighting, he'd been scrounging for firewood and had stumbled upon something unusual, a German supply cache that had been hastily abandoned, probably when American forces had advanced through the area. Joe hadn't paid much attention at the time because the cache appeared to be mostly ammunition and equipment, nothing useful to a cook. But now, in his desperate mental state, he remembered seeing crates that might not have been ammunition. Joe went to find Lieutenant Patterson, the battalion's intelligence officer, who maintained maps of the surrounding area and logs of what had been discovered. "Lieutenant, 3 days ago, about half a click northeast of here, we found an abandoned German supply point. Do you have notes on what was recovered from it?" Patterson consulted his logs. German supply cache, grid reference 467 to 832. Mostly small arms ammunition, some personal equipment. Infantry squad cleared it and took what was useful. Why? Were there any ration crates? Any food supplies? Patterson frowned, checking his notes more carefully. There's a note here that says, miscellaneous supply crates, non-priority, left in place. Could be rations, could be anything. We were more focused on weapons and ammunition at that point. "I need to check that cache," Joe said. "If there are rations there, even German rations, we might be able to supplement our supplies." Patterson looked skeptical. "That's in contested territory, Sergeant. Not behind German lines, but not exactly safe either. And even if there are German rations there, they've been sitting exposed for 3 days. Could be spoiled, could be booby-trapped. With respect, sir, we're facing a situation where this battalion is going to run out of food in less than 24 hours. I'll take exposed German rations over starving soldiers." Patterson studied Joe for a long moment. "You'd be risking your life for rations that might not exist or might not be usable." "That's my job, sir. Keeping these men fed." Patterson sighed and pulled out a map. "All right, but you're not going alone. I'll assign you 2 riflemen for security. You leave at 1,100 hours, should be able to make it there and back before dark if you're quick. And Sergeant? If you hear any German activity, you abort immediately. Understood?" "Yes, sir." The journey to the abandoned German cache was tense. Joe moved through the forest with Private Davis and Private Rodriguez providing security, both of them clearly uncomfortable with this mission. They were infantrymen, trained to fight, not to escort cooks on supply runs through contested forest. When they reached the cache location, Joe's heart sank. The site had been picked over pretty thoroughly by American soldiers looking for useful equipment. What remained was scattered debris, empty ammunition crates, torn equipment, papers blowing in the wind. But then Joe saw them, 3 wooden crates pushed against a tree, partially covered by a camouflage tarp. The crates had German military markings. Joe approached carefully, aware that abandoned supplies could be booby-trapped. He examined the crates from every angle before finally, carefully, opening the first one. Inside were German field rations, cans of preserved meat, hard biscuits, packages of dried vegetables. The second crate contained more of the same, plus some packages of dehydrated soup mix. The third crate had coffee substitute, sugar, and various condiments. It wasn't much, maybe enough to feed 100 men for a day or 2. Not nearly enough to solve their problem. But it was something, and Joe's mind was already racing, seeing possibilities. Help me load this onto the litter, Joe told Davis and Rodriguez, referring to the medical stretcher they'd brought to carry supplies. We're taking all of this back. Rodriguez looked at the crate skeptically. Sarge, there's maybe a couple days' worth of food here for a small squad. This isn't going to feed the battalion. You're right, Joe agreed. But it's going to be part of the solution. Trust me. They loaded the supplies and made the trip back to camp, arriving as twilight was falling. Joe had Martinez and Wilson secure the German supplies in their storage area, then called a meeting with his kitchen staff, 4 cooks and 6 assistants who helped with the massive task of feeding a battalion. All right, listen up, Joe began. We have a critical supply situation. Current rations will last us maybe 1 more full day if we stretch them. Resupply is minimum 3 days out, possibly longer. I need you to understand what that means. If we don't solve this problem, men are going to start collapsing from hunger in 2 days, and this entire battalion's combat effectiveness goes to 0. The group was silent, the weight of the situation settling over them. But, Joe continued, I think I have a solution. It's unconventional, possibly crazy, and it's going to require all of us working harder than we've ever worked. Here's what we're going to do. Joe laid out his plan, and as he spoke, the reactions around him ranged from skepticism to outright disbelief. You want to do what? Corporal Martinez said when Joe finished explaining. You heard me. It's going to work. It has to work. Sarge, with all respect, that's impossible. We don't have the supplies, we don't have the equipment, and even if we did, there's no way to. Martinez, Joe interrupted, his voice firm. I've been cooking for this division for 2 years. I've seen what these men can endure. I've seen them fight on empty stomachs, march on blistered feet, and hold positions when they should have retreated. They've never failed us. We're not going to fail them. This plan will work because we're going to make it work. Are you with me? Martinez looked at the other cooks, then back at Joe. Yes, Sarge. We're with you. Good. We start immediately. What Joe proposed was indeed insane by conventional standards. With inadequate food supplies, limited equipment, and no realistic prospect of resupply, Joe planned to feed 3,000 men for 3 days by implementing a system he called cascade cooking, a concept he'd developed in his mind during the walk back from the German supply cache. The basic principle was this. Instead of preparing traditional full meals 3 times a day, they would prepare smaller portions of highly concentrated, calorie-dense food that would be supplemented with field-foraged ingredients and stretched using techniques Joe had learned during the Depression when his family had often gone hungry. But the genius, or insanity, of Joe's plan lay in how he proposed to execute it. He would use the German rations as a flavor base and supplement them with whatever could be safely foraged from the Hurtgen forest. He would prepare 1 large batch of base stew that would be continuously cooking, with new ingredients added as they became available. Soldiers would receive 1 ladle of this stew 3 times a day, supplemented with any bread or biscuits that could be made from their remaining flour supplies. The plan faced immediate challenges. The most obvious was that the Hurtgen forest in November wasn't exactly a buffet of edible plants. But Joe knew from his reading and from consultations with men in the battalion who had rural backgrounds that there were possibilities. Certain tree barks could be boiled to create nutrition, pine needles could make a tea rich in vitamin C, and there were patches of hardy greens that could survive early winter. Joe organized foraging parties, assigning men from each company who had hunting or rural experience to scout for edible plants under the protection of infantry security details. It was dangerous work, sending men into the forest to look for plants while German snipers and artillery represented constant threats. But volunteers came forward, understanding that the alternative was starvation. The second challenge was cooking capacity. Joe's field kitchen equipment was designed to prepare standard military rations, not to run a continuous cooking operation. But Joe improvised, setting up additional heating stations using salvaged metal and any fuel they could find. He organized his cooking staff into shifts so that someone was always monitoring the stew pot, always adding ingredients, always adjusting flavors. The German rations provided a base. The canned meat was shredded and added to boiling water along with the dried vegetables and soup mixes. As foraging parties returned with edible plants, those were added to the pot. Joe sent men to nearby streams to fish, and any catch, however small, went into the stew. He even organized a hunting party that managed to bring down a deer, which was immediately butchered and added to the communal pot. The result was a stew that was never the same from one meal to the next, that contained ingredients most soldiers had never eaten before, but that was hot, relatively nutritious, and most importantly, available. Joe called it Hurtgen hodgepodge, and while nobody would have called it delicious, it was food, and it was enough to keep men functional. But even with the Cascade cooking system working, Joe faced another challenge: psychology. Soldiers were used to predictable meals. The uncertainty of not knowing whether there would be enough food created anxiety that affected morale. Joe needed to not just feed the men physically but also reassure them psychologically that they weren't going to starve. Joe started a communication campaign, visiting companies personally to explain the food situation honestly but also to demonstrate that there was a plan and that plan was working. He showed soldiers the continuous stew pot, explained the foraging efforts, and most importantly, promised that as long as he was breathing, no one in this battalion would go hungry. "I've been cooking since I was 8 years old," Joe told one group of skeptical soldiers. "I've made meals out of things you wouldn't believe. During the Depression, my family had weeks where all we had was flour, potatoes, and whatever my dad could bring home from the stockyards. We didn't starve then, and you're not going to starve now. You have my word." The soldiers wanted to believe him, but trust had to be earned meal by meal. The first day of the Cascade system, men received their smaller portions of Hurtgen hodgepodge with visible disappointment. This wasn't the standard meal they were used to. But they ate, and importantly, they didn't go hungry, even if they didn't feel quite full. The second day was harder. The novelty of the new system had worn off, and men were starting to feel the effects of reduced calories. Soldiers who were used to hard physical labor and combat conditions needed substantial food, and Joe's Cascade system, while preventing starvation, wasn't providing the same caloric intake as normal rations. Joe adjusted again, finding new ways to increase caloric density. He discovered that some of the German rations included concentrated fat that could be rendered and added to the stew to increase calories without increasing volume. He organized baking shifts to make more hard biscuits, using every last bit of flour and adding crushed nuts that foraging parties discovered. But the real breakthrough came on the third day, when one of the foraging parties returned with an unexpected discovery. They'd found a German food storage bunker about 2 kilometers from their position, better concealed than the supply cache Joe had discovered earlier. This bunker contained substantial supplies: sausages, canned vegetables, dried fruits, bread, and even some preserved eggs. Joe immediately organized a recovery operation, this time with full infantry support. Despite the risk of German counterattack, they needed those supplies desperately enough to justify the danger. The operation succeeded, and suddenly Joe's Cascade cooking system had enough ingredients to not just survive but to actually produce meals that soldiers might actually enjoy. Joe worked through the night, incorporating the new German supplies into his rotation. He prepared a variation of the stew that was rich with sausage and vegetables. He baked fresh bread using the German flour. He even managed to create a dessert using the dried fruits, sugar, and some creativity. The morning of the fourth day, when soldiers lined up for breakfast and were served actual sausage stew with fresh bread and a small portion of fruit compote, the response was overwhelming. Men who had been quietly concerned about food security for 3 days suddenly saw that not only were they not starving, but they were eating better than they had in weeks. Word spread through the battalion about what Joe and his cooks had accomplished. The story took on legendary qualities: a cook who could create food from nothing, who could forage from a hostile forest, who had kept 3,000 men fed during a supply crisis that should have been catastrophic. Colonel Morrison, the battalion commander, came to inspect Joe's operation on the fourth day, just as the official resupply convoy finally arrived. Morrison walked through the cooking area, examining the Cascade system Joe had developed, the foraging logs documenting what had been gathered, and the inventory sheets showing how Joe had stretched supplies that should have lasted 1 day across 4 days. "Sergeant Kowalski," Morrison said, "when you first explained this plan to me, I thought you'd lost your mind. Foraging in a combat zone? Cooking German rations? Running a continuous stew system? It sounded like a recipe for disaster." With respect, sir, it was a recipe, Joe replied with a slight smile. Just not one I'd ever made before. Morrison laughed, the first time Joe had heard the colonel laugh in weeks. Fair enough, Sergeant. Fair enough. What you've accomplished here, keeping this battalion operational during a critical supply failure, that's worth more than most combat actions. I'm recommending you for a Bronze Star, and I'm putting you up for promotion to Sergeant First Class. We need more people who can think like you, who can solve impossible problems with whatever resources are available. Thank you, sir, but I couldn't have done it alone. My whole kitchen crew will be recognized as well, Morrison assured him. But make no mistake, Kowalski, this was your innovation, your leadership, your determination that made this work. The men know it. I know it. And I'm going to make sure the division knows it. News of Joe's achievement spread beyond the 3rd Battalion. Other units in the 1st Infantry Division began requesting information about the Cascade cooking system. Division quartermaster officers studied Joe's techniques, recognizing that this represented a fundamental innovation in field logistics, a way to maintain troop readiness even when supply chains failed. Joe found himself pulled away from cooking duties to brief officers on his methods, to write reports documenting the Cascade system, and to train other cooks in the techniques he'd developed. It was flattering but also frustrating. Joe was a cook, not a lecturer, and he wanted to be back in the kitchen feeding soldiers. But he also recognized that his innovations could help keep other soldiers fed in other desperate situations, and that was worth the temporary disruption to his routine. Joe spent several weeks traveling between different units within the division, demonstrating his methods, explaining the principles behind Cascade cooking, and helping other cooks develop their own local variations. The experience changed Joe's perspective on his role in the military. He'd always seen himself as support personnel, important but somehow separate from the real soldiers who fought the battles. But watching how his work had directly enabled the battalion to maintain combat readiness during a critical period, seeing how food security affected morale and operational capability, Joe came to understand that logistics wasn't support for the war effort, it was a crucial component of the war effort itself. The Hurtgen Forest campaign continued through November and December 1944, some of the hardest fighting American forces experienced in Europe. The 1st Infantry Division suffered significant casualties, and the forest itself became synonymous with the grinding, brutal nature of close-quarters combat in difficult terrain. But through it all, Joe and his kitchen crews kept the men fed, adapted the Cascade cooking system as needed, and ensured that food shortages never again threatened operational readiness. When the division finally pulled out of the Hurtgen in December for rest and refit, Joe was exhausted but proud. His kitchen crew had prepared over 150,000 meals during the campaign, had improvised solutions to dozens of supply challenges, and had kept men fed under conditions that would have broken traditional field kitchen operations. At a division ceremony in January 1945, Joe received his Bronze Star from General Hubner, the division commander. The citation read, "For meritorious service in connection with military operations against an armed enemy." Staff Sergeant Kowalski displayed extraordinary ingenuity and determination in maintaining food services for a battalion of the 1st Infantry Division during a critical supply shortage in November 1944. His innovative Cascade cooking system enabled the battalion to maintain operational readiness despite logistics failures that threatened to compromise the unit's combat effectiveness. Staff Sergeant Kowalski's actions reflect great credit upon himself and the military service. The ceremony was brief, the war was still ongoing and there was work to do, but it meant everything to Joe. Not because of the medal or the recognition, but because it represented acknowledgement that keeping soldiers fed was as important as any other aspect of military operations. After the war, Joe returned to Chicago and resumed his civilian cooking career, but with a different perspective. He opened his own restaurant in 1947, a modest place that served hearty, simple food at reasonable prices. The restaurant became popular not because of fancy dishes or elaborate presentations, but because Joe cooked the way he'd cooked during the war, with an understanding that food was about more than just nutrition, that it was about community, comfort, and the basic human need to be cared for. Joe rarely talked about his military service, even when customers noticed the Bronze Star certificate hanging in a small frame behind the counter. But occasionally, when circumstances called for it, Joe would tell the story of the Hurtgen Forest, of 3,000 men facing starvation, of a cooking system born from desperation and necessity, and of the principle that had guided his entire career: no one goes hungry if there's anything you can do to prevent it. In 1984, 40 years after the events in the Hurtgen Forest, the 1st Infantry Division Association held a reunion in Chicago. Joe, now 71 and retired, attended and found himself surrounded by men who had been soldiers in the 3rd Battalion during that November in 1944. They were old now, grandfathers and great-grandfathers, but they remembered the food crisis and Joe's solution. One of them, a former corporal named Mike Sullivan, stood to speak at the reunion dinner. A lot of people talk about the heroes of the Hurtgen Forest, and they talk about the combat soldiers, the medics, the officers who led us through hell. All of that's deserved. But I want to talk about a different kind of hero. I want to talk about the cook who kept us from starving when our supply lines failed. Joe Kowalski saved our lives just as surely as any medic who patched up wounds or any soldier who held a position against German attack. Sullivan turned to look directly at Joe. "You told us you'd keep us fed, Joe. You promised no one would go hungry. And you kept that promise through pure determination and ingenuity. Some of us are alive today because you figured out how to make food appear when there wasn't any. That's not just cooking, Joe. That's magic. That's heroism. And 40 years later, I wanted you to know that we never forgot." The room erupted in applause, and Joe stood, moved beyond words, acknowledging the recognition from men whose respect meant more to him than any medal ever could. When Joe Kowalski died in 1992 at the age of 79, his obituary in the Chicago Tribune mentioned his Bronze Star and his role in the Hurtgen Forest campaign, but it focused primarily on his restaurant and his reputation in the Chicago food community. It was a modest obituary for a modest man. But at his funeral, which was attended by dozens of former soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division, the eulogy told a different story. It spoke of a man who had understood that war was fought not just with weapons but with logistics, not just with tactics but with the basic necessities of keeping human beings alive and functioning. It spoke of innovation born from necessity, of leadership demonstrated through action rather than rank, and of a philosophy that valued every individual life enough to fight desperately to preserve it. The Cascade cooking system that Joe developed in the Hurtgen Forest was studied by military logistics experts for decades afterward. Elements of it were incorporated into U.S. Army Field Manual on Emergency Food Service Operations. The principle that Joe had demonstrated, that field kitchens could operate effectively even with severe supply disruptions if personnel were creative and determined, influenced how the military thought about food logistics in austere environments. But beyond the tactical and logistical lessons, Joe Kowalski's story represented something deeper about the nature of service and innovation. He had been a cook, a role often dismissed as non-combat support, yet his innovation had been as critical to his unit's success as any battlefield tactic. He had faced an impossible problem, feeding thousands with resources for dozens, and rather than accepting defeat, he had created a solution that no manual or regulation had anticipated. Joe's insane plan to save the Big Red One from starving wasn't insane at all, it turned out. It was brilliant, practical, and humane. It was the work of someone who understood both the technical challenges of food preparation and the human needs of soldiers who depended on him. It was innovation driven by necessity, leadership demonstrated through action, and heroism measured not in bullets fired but in meals served and lives sustained. And perhaps most importantly, it was a reminder that in warfare, as in life, the most critical victories are often won not by those who follow established procedures but by those who have the courage to imagine new solutions when the old ones fail, and the determination to implement those solutions even when everyone else thinks they're crazy. But what the official records never captured, what even Joe's Bronze Star citation couldn't convey, was the human cost of those desperate days in the Hurtgen Forest. The Cascade cooking system had worked, yes, but it had demanded sacrifices that Joe would carry for the rest of his life. And there was a darker chapter to the story, one that Joe rarely discussed and that haunted him in ways that no medal could ease. On the 5th day after the supply crisis began, just as the official resupply convoy was finally arriving, A tragedy occurred that would fundamentally change Joe's understanding of his role and responsibilities. One of the foraging parties he'd sent out, 3 soldiers from Charlie Company led by Corporal Eddie Brennan, failed to return from their mission to gather edible plants from a section of forest that had been declared relatively secure. Joe waited through the afternoon, then into evening, growing increasingly anxious. Foraging parties were supposed to be back by 1600 hours. By 1800 hours, with darkness falling and no sign of Brennan's party, Joe knew something had gone terribly wrong. A search party was organized, and what they found made Joe physically ill. The 3 soldiers had been killed by German artillery. Apparently they'd been in the wrong place when a barrage came in, targeting American positions but catching the foraging party in the open. They died instantly, their bodies found scattered in a small clearing along with bags of the wild greens and edible roots they'd been collecting. Eddie Brennan had been 22 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania. The other 2 soldiers, Private Jackson and Private DeMarco, had been even younger. All 3 had volunteered for the foraging parties, understanding the risks but believing that feeding their fellow soldiers was worth the danger. Joe attended the brief field service for the 3 men, standing in the cold November rain as the chaplain said words that were supposed to provide comfort but that only made Joe feel worse. These men had died gathering plants. They hadn't died in combat, hadn't died taking a German position or defending against an attack. They'd died doing work that Joe had asked them to do, work that shouldn't have been necessary if the supply system had functioned properly. After the service, Colonel Morrison pulled Joe aside. "Sergeant, I know what you're thinking. I know you're blaming yourself for those men's deaths. Don't. They were soldiers operating in a combat zone. The risks they took gathering food were no different than the risks any soldier takes every day in this forest. You didn't kill them. The Germans did." "With respect, sir, I sent them out there," Joe replied, his voice hollow. "I asked for volunteers to forage because we needed food. They died because of my plan." "They died," Morrison corrected firmly, "because we're at war and soldiers die in war. If those men hadn't been foraging, they might have been on patrol, on guard duty, or in combat. The foraging work didn't expose them to significantly more risk than any other duty in the Hurtgen forest. You understand that, Sergeant?" Joe nodded, but he didn't really understand it, didn't really believe it. For the rest of the campaign, every time he used ingredients that foraging parties had gathered, every time he prepared meals that kept men fed and operational, Joe thought about Eddie Brennan and Jackson and DeMarco. The price of his insane plan hadn't just been hard work and innovation. It had been measured in American lives lost collecting plants in a hostile forest. The weight of that responsibility stayed with Joe through the rest of the war. When he was promoted to Sergeant First Class and given broader responsibilities for food logistics across the division, he implemented new safety protocols for any foraging or supplemental food gathering operations. He personally vetted every location before allowing soldiers to operate there. He limited foraging parties to areas that were truly secure, even if it meant fewer supplements for the Cascade cooking system. Some officers thought Joe was being overly cautious, that he was letting guilt cloud his operational judgment. But Joe was adamant. "I will not send men to their deaths gathering food," he said during one heated discussion with a quartermaster officer who wanted to expand foraging operations. "I will stretch supplies, I will improvise with what we have, I will cook miracles out of nothing if I have to. But I won't risk more lives than absolutely necessary for supplemental food gathering." The argument became moot as supply lines improved through early 1945 and the need for extreme measures like Cascade cooking diminished. But the principle Joe had established, that food logistics, no matter how critical, didn't justify unnecessary risks to soldiers' lives, became part of his operational philosophy and would influence military food service doctrine for decades. Another complication emerged in December 1944, shortly after the Hurtgen campaign ended. Joe began receiving reports that some soldiers who had eaten the Cascade meals, particularly the foraged plant materials, were experiencing digestive problems. Most cases were minor, stomach discomfort, mild nausea, but several soldiers developed more serious reactions that required medical attention. The division medical officer, Captain Hernandez, called Joe in for a meeting that was both professional consultation and subtle interrogation. Sergeant Kowalski, we're seeing an uptick in gastrointestinal complaints from men who were in your battalion during the supply crisis. I need you to tell me everything about the foods you prepared, every ingredient, every source, every preparation method. Joe went through the entire cascade cooking process in detail, explaining the foraging operations, the German rations they'd incorporated, the continuous cooking method that kept everything at temperatures that should have killed harmful bacteria. As he spoke, he could see Hernandez making notes, his expression growing increasingly concerned. Here's the problem, Hernandez explained when Joe finished. Some of the plants your foraging parties collected, we've identified them from samples that were preserved, include species that are technically edible but that can cause digestive distress, especially in people who aren't accustomed to them. Nothing poisonous, nothing that would cause serious long-term harm, but uncomfortable and potentially debilitating for soldiers who need to be at peak physical condition. I had men with rural experience identifying plants, Joe said defensively. I specifically instructed them to only gather plants they were certain were safe. I know you did, Hernandez replied, his tone sympathetic rather than accusatory. But safe to eat and safe to eat in large quantities repeatedly are different standards. Some of these plants are fine in small amounts but cause problems when they become a dietary staple. You fed men these plants 3 times a day for 4 days. That's more exposure than most people would ever have to some of these species. Joe felt sick. How many men are affected? About 40 cases of minor complaints, 6 cases requiring medical intervention. All are recovering and there don't appear to be any permanent effects. But it's something we need to document and learn from for future operations. The conversation haunted Joe almost as much as the deaths of the foraging party. He'd been so focused on the immediate problem of preventing starvation that he hadn't adequately considered the longer-term health effects of the foods he was preparing. Men who had trusted him to keep them safe had gotten sick because of decisions he'd made. Joe went to visit the soldiers who had required medical treatment for food-related illnesses. Most were gracious, understanding that Joe had been dealing with an impossible situation. But one soldier, a private named Kelly from 2nd Company, was bitter. "You made us sick, Sarge," Kelly said from his hospital bed. "I know you were trying to feed us, I know supplies were short, but you fed us stuff that made us sick. I've been vomiting for 2 days. I can't keep anything down. How is that better than just being hungry for a couple days until supplies arrived?" Joe had no good answer. "I'm sorry, Private. I was trying to keep everyone fed and operational. I made mistakes in judgment about which plants were safe to use extensively. That's on me." "Yeah, it is on you," Kelly agreed, then his expression softened slightly. "But I guess you were in an impossible situation. Just, next time, maybe let us be a little hungry instead of making us sick, okay?" The incident led to Joe working with division medical staff to develop better protocols for food safety during supply emergencies. They created guidelines for identifying and preparing wild foods, established consultation procedures so that medical officers could review foraging plans before implementation, and developed training materials for cooks on food safety under field conditions. The work was important and necessary, but it was also a reminder of the fine line Joe had walked during the supply crisis. The line between innovation that saved lives and improvisation that created new problems. The fact that most of the Cascade cooking system had worked brilliantly didn't erase the reality that parts of it had caused harm, however unintentionally. These complications, the deaths of the foraging party, the illness from improperly vetted wild foods, the questions about whether extreme measures had been truly necessary, cast shadows over Joe's achievement. The official narrative celebrated his innovation and determination. The Bronze Star recognized his meritorious service. But Joe knew the complete story was more complex, more morally ambiguous, and more costly than the medals suggested. When Joe returned to Chicago after the war and opened his restaurant, he approached cooking with a different philosophy than he'd had before. Where once he'd been willing to experiment boldly, to try unusual ingredients and techniques, now he was conservative, careful, deeply concerned with safety and consistency. His restaurant served simple, familiar food prepared with meticulous attention to quality and safety. Some food critics called it boring, unadventurous. Joe didn't care. He never wanted anyone to get sick from food he'd prepared, never wanted to take risks with people's health in the name of culinary innovation. His wife, Anna, whom he'd married in 1946, eventually drew the connection between Joe's wartime experiences and his conservative approach to his restaurant. "You're still carrying the Hurtgen Forest with you," she said one night in 1952, after Joe had spent hours obsessing over whether his supplier's meat met his standards. "You're still afraid of making people sick, still guilty about those soldiers who died foraging." "I should be," Joe replied. "Those things happened because of my decisions. I can't just forget them." "No one expects you to forget them," Anna said gently. "But you can't let guilt paralyze you either. What you did during that supply crisis saved lives, Joe. Thousands of soldiers stayed fed and operational because of your innovation. A few men died in dangerous work that was dangerous because there was a war, not because you asked them to do it. And some men got sick from wild foods, but none died, all recovered, and that's still better than 3,000 men starving. You need to accept that you did the best you could with an impossible situation." "Did I, though?" Joe challenged. "Or did I take unnecessary risks? Did I push too hard, try too much, expose men to dangers that better judgment would have avoided?" Anna didn't have an answer to that, and Joe knew he would never have a clear answer either. The question of whether his actions during the supply crisis had been justified, whether the risks had been worth the benefits, whether different choices might have achieved the same results with less cost, these were questions that haunted Joe for decades. In 1960, Joe was contacted by a military historian from the Army War College who was researching logistics operations during World War II. The historian, Dr. William Foster, wanted to interview Joe extensively about the Cascade cooking system and the supply crisis in the Hurtgen Forest. Joe agreed, though with some reluctance. During their conversations, Dr. Foster asked Joe the questions that no one else had asked, the questions about the decisions Joe had made and their consequences. "Sergeant Kowalski," Foster said during one session, "you're viewed as a hero for your actions during the supply crisis. But I've read the medical reports, I've seen the casualty records for the foraging parties. Was the Cascade cooking system worth the costs it imposed?" Joe considered the question for a long time before answering. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I can tell you that at the time, facing the immediate crisis, it seemed like the only viable option. I can tell you that the majority of the system worked well and achieved its objectives. But I can also tell you that people died and people got sick because of decisions I made. Whether the benefits outweighed the costs, that's a calculation I'm not sure anyone can make objectively." "Let me pose a hypothetical," Foster said. "If you could go back to November 1944, knowing what you know now about the consequences, would you implement the Cascade cooking system again?" "Yes," Joe said without hesitation, then added, "but I would do it differently. I would be more careful about food safety. I would implement stricter security protocols for foraging operations. I would push back harder against pressure to take risks. But the basic concept, finding ways to stretch inadequate supplies to keep soldiers fed, that was necessary and right." Foster's research eventually became part of a case study used at the Army War College on logistics innovation under crisis conditions. The case study was balanced, acknowledging both the successes and the problems with Joe's approach. It concluded that the Cascade cooking system represented valuable innovation but also highlighted the importance of considering secondary effects and unintended consequences when implementing emergency measures. Joe was invited to participate in a panel discussion at the War College in 1965, where he spoke to future military leaders about his experiences. During the Q&A session, a young officer asked Joe what advice he would give to someone facing a similar crisis situation. "First," Joe replied, "understand that there are no perfect solutions in crisis situations. Every choice involves trade-offs, risks, potential negative consequences. Your job isn't to find a perfect solution, it's to find the best available solution given the constraints you're operating under." Second, he continued, innovation is necessary but it must be balanced with caution. Being creative and taking calculated risks can solve problems that conventional approaches can't. But calculated is the key word. You need to think through consequences, anticipate problems, and have mitigation strategies. Third, and most importantly, never lose sight of the human beings affected by your decisions. Every soldier who ate the Cascade meals, every man who went on a foraging party, every person who got sick from wild foods, they weren't statistics or operational factors. They were individuals whose lives I was responsible for. That responsibility should weigh on you. It should inform every decision you make. And you should carry it with you always, not as a burden that paralyzes you, but as a reminder of what's at stake in everything you do. The young officer who had asked the question thanked Joe for his candor. After the session, he approached Joe privately. "Sir, I appreciate your honesty about the complications and costs of your actions. Most of the veterans we hear from just talk about their successes. It's valuable to hear someone talk about the hard parts, the mistakes, the things they wish they'd done differently." "The hard parts are where the real lessons are," Joe replied. "Anyone can succeed when everything goes right. The measure of leadership is how you handle situations where nothing goes right, where every choice is bad and you're just trying to choose the least bad option." In his final years, Joe became more open about discussing the full complexity of his wartime experiences. In 1988, he was interviewed for an oral history project documenting the experiences of World War II veterans. The interviewer asked Joe how he wanted to be remembered. "I want people to know the truth," Joe said. "Not the sanitized version where I'm a hero who saved everyone. I want them to know that I made difficult decisions under terrible pressure, that some of those decisions led to people getting hurt or dying, and that I've lived with that knowledge every day since. I want them to understand that heroism isn't clean or simple, that innovation comes with risks, and that doing your duty sometimes means making choices that haunt you. But I also want people to know," he continued, "that despite the costs and complications, I believe what I did was necessary. Those soldiers needed to be fed. They depended on me. And I found a way to keep them fed when conventional methods had failed. I would make the same basic choice again, even knowing the costs, because the alternative, 3,000 men starving and unable to fight, was unacceptable." When Joe Kowalski died in 1992, his obituary in the Chicago Tribune mentioned his Bronze Star and his role in the Hurtgen Forest campaign, but it focused primarily on his restaurant and his reputation in the Chicago food community. It was a modest obituary for a modest man. But at his funeral, which was attended by dozens of former soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division, the eulogy told a fuller story, one that included not just the innovation and success, but also the costs, the mistakes, the moral complexity. The eulogy, delivered by Mike Sullivan, one of the 3rd Battalion veterans, captured the essence of who Joe had been and what he had achieved. "Joe Kowalski saved lives," Sullivan said. "That's the simple truth. But the way he saved those lives was complicated, costly, and imperfect. Some men died during foraging operations. Some men got sick from the food. Joe himself carried guilt about those consequences for 50 years. But what Joe understood, what made him extraordinary, was that imperfect action that saves lives is better than perfect inaction that saves no one." "Joe taught us something crucial about leadership and innovation," Sullivan continued. "He taught us that sometimes you have to act even when you don't have all the answers, even when every choice involves risks, even when you know some things will go wrong. He taught us that responsibility means making hard choices and then living with the consequences, not avoiding difficult decisions because you're afraid of making mistakes. And most importantly," Sullivan concluded, "Joe taught us that heroism isn't about being perfect or fearless or having everything work out exactly right. It's about doing your best under impossible circumstances, accepting responsibility for your actions and their consequences, and never stopping trying to do right by the people who depend on you. That's the legacy Joe leaves us, not a story of flawless success, but an honest account of a good man doing difficult work with integrity, courage, and profound respect for human life. The complete story of how a cook's insane plans saved the Big Red One from starving turned out to be more complex than any medal citation could capture. It was a story of innovation and sacrifice, success and cost, heroism and humility. It was a story about the reality that in warfare, as in life, solving one problem often creates new problems, that every solution carries risks, and that the measure of leadership is not avoiding all negative consequences but making the best choices possible given the constraints and then taking responsibility for whatever follows. Joe's cascade cooking system worked. That was undeniable. It kept thousands of soldiers fed when they would have otherwise starved. But it also cost lives, caused illness, and created complications that Joe spent the rest of his life trying to understand and reconcile. The genius of what Joe achieved wasn't just the innovation itself, but his willingness to grapple honestly with both its benefits and its costs, to carry the weight of responsibility for every consequence of his choices, and to ensure that future generations learned not just from his successes but also from his mistakes and struggles. That complete, honest, complicated legacy, far more than any Bronze Star or promotion, was Joe Kowalski's real contribution to military logistics and to our understanding of what it means to lead, to innovate, and to serve with integrity in situations where there are no perfect answers and where doing your best sometimes means accepting that your best will never be quite good enough. But there was one final chapter to Joe's story that he never shared publicly, a chapter that only came to light when his personal papers were donated to the National World War II Museum in 2005, 13 years after his death. Among those papers was a series of letters exchanged between Joe and the families of the 3 soldiers who had died during foraging operations, correspondence that revealed the depth of Joe's sense of responsibility and the unexpected connections that emerged from tragedy. The first letter, dated February 1945, was from Joe to Mrs. Catherine Brennan, the mother of Corporal Eddie Brennan. In it, Joe explained in detail what had happened to her son, taking full responsibility for having organized the foraging operations that led to Eddie's death. The letter was extraordinary in its honesty and its refusal to hide behind military necessity or official explanations. "Dear Mrs. Brennan," the letter began, "I write to you not as a representative of the Army but as the man who asked your son to volunteer for the work that led to his death. I cannot offer you comfort because there is no comfort adequate to the loss of a child. I can only offer you the truth about why Eddie died and my solemn promise that his sacrifice will not be forgotten or diminished." The letter went on to explain the supply crisis, the cascade cooking system, and the necessity of foraging operations. But it didn't stop there. Joe wrote about Eddie personally, about his enthusiasm as a volunteer, about his skill in identifying edible plants, about the jokes he told to keep morale up during the grim days in the Hurtgen forest. Joe described Eddie not as a casualty statistic but as the young man he had been, making it clear that Joe saw Eddie as an individual whose loss mattered profoundly. "I carry your son's death with me every day," Joe wrote in conclusion. "I will carry it for the rest of my life. Not because I believe that is what you want or what Eddie would want, but because it is the weight I must bear for having asked him to take risks that cost him his life. If there is anything I can ever do for you or your family, please let me know. I owe Eddie a debt I can never repay." What happened next was something Joe never anticipated. Mrs. Brennan wrote back, a letter that arrived in April 1945 as the war in Europe was entering its final weeks. Her response wasn't angry or accusatory. It was gracious, thoughtful, and in its own way, comforting to Joe in ways he didn't expect. "Dear Sergeant Kowalski," Mrs. Brennan wrote, "thank you for your honest letter about my Eddie's death. You did not have to write to me directly. You could have let the official notification stand. But you chose to take personal responsibility and to tell me the full truth. That takes courage, and it means more to me than you might imagine." She continued, "Eddie wrote to me about you in his last letter home. He told me about the supply crisis and about the foraging operations. He told me that you were the kind of leader who cared about every soldier, who would do anything to keep them safe and fed. He volunteered for that foraging party, Sergeant, not because you forced him but because he believed in what you were trying to do. He believed those operations were important and that the risks were worth taking. I am heartbroken to have lost my son," the letter concluded. "I will miss him every day for the rest of my life. But I would rather have a son who died trying to help his fellow soldiers, who volunteered for dangerous work because he believed it mattered, than a son who took no risks and made no difference. Eddie died serving his country and his comrades. That is not meaningless. Please do not let your guilt about his death diminish the value of what he chose to do." The letter devastated Joe emotionally but also provided a form of absolution he hadn't realized he needed. Mrs. Brennan's perspective, that Eddie had made his own choice to volunteer, that the work had mattered, that dying in service to others wasn't meaningless, didn't erase Joe's guilt, but it contextualized it in ways that made it more bearable. Joe and Mrs. Brennan continued corresponding for years after the war. Joe sent her photographs from the battalion's time in Europe, shared stories about Eddie from soldiers who had known him, and eventually visited the Brennan family in Pennsylvania in 1948. That visit, which Joe had dreaded, turned into a profound experience of connection and mutual healing. The Brennan family, Catherine, her husband Thomas, and Eddie's younger sister Margaret, welcomed Joe into their home with warmth that he didn't feel he deserved. They showed him Eddie's childhood bedroom, still preserved as it had been when Eddie left for the war. They shared family photographs and stories. They asked Joe to tell them everything he remembered about Eddie's time in the army. On the second day of the visit, Thomas Brennan took Joe aside for a private conversation. "Sergeant, can I still call you that?" "Joe is fine, sir." "Joe, I want you to know something. Catherine and we don't blame you for Eddie's death. We never did. The Army wrote us about the circumstances, and we understood that Eddie was killed doing necessary work during wartime. But more than that, we've come to see that you've punished yourself far more than we ever could or would want to. You need to forgive yourself, Joe. Eddie wouldn't want you carrying this guilt for the rest of your life." "I asked him to volunteer for dangerous work," Joe said quietly. "That makes me responsible." "You asked," Thomas emphasized. "You didn't order. You didn't force. Eddie chose to volunteer because he believed in what you were trying to do. That was his decision, his choice. You can honor that choice, you can remember Eddie, you can carry the responsibility of leadership that sometimes requires asking people to take risks. But you can't take away Eddie's agency, his choice to serve his fellow soldiers. That choice was his, and it mattered to him. Don't diminish it by making it only about your guilt." The conversation shifted something in Joe. He would never stop feeling the weight of Eddie Brennan's death, but he began to understand it differently, not as a failure of leadership but as a tragic consequence of necessary wartime operations in which Eddie had been a willing participant who understood the risks. The connection Joe formed with the Brennan family extended into the next generation. Eddie's younger sister Margaret, who had been 14 when her brother died, grew up with Joe as a presence in her life, not a replacement for Eddie but someone who could share stories about her brother's army service that the family would otherwise never have known. When Margaret got married in 1954, she invited Joe to the wedding. When she had children, she named her first son Edward Joseph, Edward for her brother, Joseph for Joe. Joe's relationship with the families of the other two soldiers who died during foraging operations, Private Jackson's parents and Private DeMarco's widow, followed similar patterns. Joe wrote to them with the same honesty he'd shown Mrs. Brennan, taking responsibility for their losses while honoring the men who had died. The responses varied. Jackson's father was more angry and less forgiving than Mrs. Brennan had been, while DeMarco's young widow was grateful for any information about her husband's final days. But in each case, Joe maintained the connection, sent Christmas cards, attended memorial services when he could, and ensured that these families knew their loved ones had not been forgotten. It was Joe's way of honoring the sacrifice, of ensuring that the men who had died during his foraging operations were remembered as individuals with families and futures that had been cut short. In 1968, on the 24th anniversary of the Hurtgen Forest Campaign, Joe received an unexpected letter from Robert Jackson, the son of Private Jackson who had died during foraging operations. Robert had been only 6 years old when his father died, and he wrote to Joe as a 28-year-old man trying to understand the father he'd barely known. "Mr. Kowalski," the letter began, "I'm writing because my mother recently passed away, and while going through her belongings, I found the letters you sent to her after my father's death. I never knew about those letters. I think my mother kept them private because she wanted to protect me from the details of my father's death while I was young. But now that I've read them, I wanted to reach out to you." The letter continued, "My grandfather was angry about my father's death. He blamed you for years. But reading your letters, seeing how you took responsibility and how you honored my father's memory, I understand now that you weren't a careless leader sending men to their deaths. You were a man facing impossible choices who did what you thought was necessary and then lived with the consequences. That's not villainous, that's human. I wanted you to know, Robert concluded, that my father's death, however tragic, led to something good. The Cascade cooking system you developed saved thousands of soldiers from starvation. Some of those soldiers came home and had children. Children who exist because you found a way to keep their fathers fed and operational during a critical period. My father died helping with that work. That means something. That matters. I hope you can find peace with that. Joe kept Robert Jackson's letter in his wallet for the rest of his life, reading it whenever he felt overwhelmed by guilt about the decisions he'd made in the Hurtgen Forest. The letter represented a kind of forgiveness from the next generation, an acknowledgement that tragedy and meaning could coexist, that difficult choices in wartime had to be evaluated not just by their immediate costs but by their broader effects. These personal connections, with the Brennan family, with Robert Jackson, with others affected by his wartime decisions, became central to how Joe understood his legacy. The Cascade cooking system was documented in military manuals. His innovations influenced logistics planning for decades. But these human relationships, these ongoing acknowledgments of cost and responsibility, were what really defined Joe's character and his understanding of what leadership meant. In his final interview before his death in 1992, conducted by a graduate student researching World War II home front and military connections, Joe was asked what he would want people to remember about the Hurtgen Forest supply crisis and the Cascade cooking system. I want people to remember all of it, Joe said. The innovation, yes, but also the costs. The lives saved, absolutely, but also the lives lost. The success of keeping 3,000 soldiers fed, certainly, but also the complications and mistakes. And most of all, I want people to remember that innovation in wartime, leadership under pressure, solving impossible problems, all of that requires accepting responsibility for every consequence, good and bad. I stayed connected with the families of the men who died during foraging operations, Joe continued. Not because it made me feel better, it didn't really, but because those men died doing work I asked them to do, and I owed it to them and their families to never forget that, to never let their sacrifice be reduced to a footnote in a success story. That's what real leadership requires, carrying the weight of every decision, honoring every consequence, and accepting that your successes will always be shadowed by the costs that made them possible. When Joe Kowalski died at age 79, his funeral was attended by 3 generations of the Brennan family, by Robert Jackson and his children, and by scores of Big Red 1 veterans who had been fed by the Cascade cooking system during those desperate days in the Hurtgen Forest. The memorial service included readings from the letters Joe had exchanged with soldiers' families over nearly 50 years, letters that revealed a man who had refused to let success erase responsibility, who had maintained connections with those affected by his decisions, and who had understood that true leadership meant living with consequences rather than hiding from them. Margaret Brennan Henderson, Eddie Brennan's younger sister who was now in her 60s, spoke at the service. Joe Kowalski saved thousands of lives during the war, she said. But what made him truly exceptional wasn't just that achievement. It was that he never forgot the cost of that achievement. He never forgot my brother Eddie. He never forgot the other men who died or were hurt. He carried them with him for 50 years. Not as burdens that crushed him but as responsibilities that defined him. Joe taught our family something crucial about honor and memory, she continued. He taught us that remembering the fallen isn't just about annual ceremonies or memorial plaques. It's about sustained connection, about ensuring that the people who died are known as individuals, not statistics. It's about accepting that their deaths mattered not because they were sacrifices for some greater good, but because they were human beings with families and futures that were taken from them. Joe never let us forget Eddie, and he never let himself forget that Eddie's death was a consequence of decisions Joe made. That's integrity. That's character. That's the kind of leadership that changes not just military operations but human understanding. The full story of Joe Kowalski, cook, innovator, leader, and man who carried the weight of his wartime decisions for 50 years, became a case study not just in military logistics but in ethical leadership, in how to take responsibility for complex decisions with mixed outcomes, and in how to honor both success and sacrifice without diminishing either. The Cascade cooking system was brilliant, saved lives, and represented genuine innovation. But Joe's real legacy was showing that innovation comes with responsibilities that extend far beyond the immediate problem being solved, that leadership means accepting all consequences of your decisions, and that integrity means never letting success become an excuse to forget cost. The letters between Joe and the families of fallen soldiers, preserved in archives and made available to researchers, stand as testament to what military leadership should look like, not just tactical brilliance or technical innovation, but profound moral seriousness about the human consequences of every decision. Joe's insane plan to save the Big Red One from starving worked, but Joe understood that working didn't mean it was cost-free, and he spent the rest of his life ensuring that neither he nor anyone else forgot what that success had required from those who didn't survive to see it.